All right, so today we're talking about how to choose your grid for folding more repeats of an origami tessellation. This is something that I definitely talk about in the Advent of Tess ebooks. You can see I've got a whole page on it here, and we're going to go through these different sections of whether you want to fold a practice piece, whether you want to fold a display piece, and how many repeats will fit in a certain number of grid divisions. So some context on this question. This is both the simplest and most complex question that you can ask about an origami tessellation. Simplest because any grid will work. You can always fold a tessellation on whatever grid you have. Most complex because really digging deep into what grid to use gets you into the mathiest part of origami tessellations, gets you into all of these abstractions that I teach in some of my bigger courses, tessellations by tiles, into advanced twist techniques. But the main thing that I teach around this topic is the project planning masterclass. And that's something that I have associated with all of my tessellation crease patterns that I've produced. It's over 430 and counting at this point inside of Tessellation Garden, which you can find a link to get down below. But let's start with how would you go about folding a certain number of repeats of a certain pattern. And this pattern is particularly nice to look at because it's hexagons and triangles, which means it has a clearer folding sequence than a lot of the ones with rhombi. And also it's alternating. So it's a simpler structure than we see elsewhere. And when I'm looking at this pattern, the first thing on this cover page is I see, okay, it uses open hexagons and closed triangles. It has a difficulty rating of 1 out of 5. That's the lowest difficulty rating I have. And we've got this strange line, rotation A over L equals 1/3. Now that's the part that's more advanced. That's getting into the math of things. But I've already done the math for you. This is the result. So going down, well, what that tells me right away is that having a grid that's folded the normal way, where you have the grid lines parallel to the edge of the paper, like let's say I've got this little grid, my grid lines are parallel to the edges of the paper. What that 1/3 tells me is that that's not going to align the pattern repeats with the edge. I'm going to need a different arrangement of grid lines on the paper to get perfect alignment, like you see in the photo. And coming on down, I can see the full crease pattern on a 64 fold grid. So 64 divisions from one side to the opposite side. And I can find my central twist. So my mouse is on the center right here. I'm looking at it as, okay, coming in from this corner and coming in from that corner, where do those grid lines meet? That's my center. And all of my crease patterns are drawn on this style of grid. So tessellations are infinite. We need to choose ourselves what portion of them to fold. Drawing the crease pattern on this size of grid is not a folding recommendation. But what we can see here is we have our central hexagon, and then we have the hexagons surrounding that hexagon. And so if we have a question of how much grid do I need to fold one ring around the center, then I can come in and I'll go ahead and zoom in a little. And at this level of resolution, you don't really have to say like, okay, this one specifically is the center. I can see on my screen that there's slightly thicker grid lines going into the center and every 8 grid spacings after, but you won't necessarily see that on the video feed. But it is visible if you do get the ebook and zoom all the way in. So I can count from the center of this hexagon going down 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. 10 spacings is almost there. If I was just trying to get these hexagons and I was using a rotated grid, then that would be fine. Let's see, this was 10 and then 12. Okay, if I'm using a diagonal grid, like if the edge of my paper is passing in this direction, then 12 is okay. And I lost my place, so I'm going to count out again. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. And I can follow, excuse me, can follow the grid lines out in the 2 directions around this area that I'm considering and say, gee, that's really close to these twists that I want to fold. Let's go a little bit further out. We can go 14, and then we're probably going to want to go to 16 out from the center. And 16 out from the center is 32 total. So anytime we're counting out from the center, we want to multiply by 2 to get our full number. And that would be 32 divisions to get a full set of repeats around the center. We're going to have a bit of a border on that because we went another 4 spacings after the bare minimum value. And then how many spacings then to get the next set of repeats? So again, I lost my count. I'll go 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18. And what I'm looking for is, and I have to use my mouse to show this, unfortunately, is this set of 3 hexagons and the triangles just past them that are contributed to by 2 of those hexagons. So I'm looking and I'm seeing oh, if I'm down here, I need the edge of the paper to go across like this in order to fit all of those on the paper. Because if I'm here and the edge of my paper goes up like this, I'm going to be cutting through some of those. So that's getting into, okay, we have our pattern, now we need to read it. And there are certain properties of patterns. The way that the twists are connected, this is called a tiling, that can make a huge difference for how we think about the pattern itself and how it repeats. So this is something that I teach in tessellations by tiles. Here I have the hexagons and triangles tiling. And whenever I'm thinking about project planning, I'm really thinking at the tiling level. Even though all of the specific numbers are specific to the pattern, what I'm thinking about is, can I get all of something that is included in one of these boundary lines? So these are the rings around the center that I'll be adding. And so if I want 1 ring around the center, then I'm looking for these 2 hexagons outside of the central hexagon, or the 1 hexagon, and then making sure I clear its neighbors. The next ring around has 3 hexagons per side. The next ring around has 4. And we just go increasing, increasing, increasing the number of hexagons per side as we go out. But how can you see this structure on the crease pattern? Well, that's where we start drawing on the crease pattern. And you can either print it out or like print out a zoomed in copy, or you can go into your favorite vector graphic software. So here in the Advent of Tess 2023 ebook, I see I'm looking at page 58. And so I can go into my files and actually go to the ebook and say open with other application, and I'm going to choose Inkscape. You can choose whatever vector graphic software you prefer, and select that. So Adobe Illustrator is the other common one, but it's expensive. And eventually it will give me the option, okay, do I want all the pages? No, I want page 58. And we're going to say okay. And eventually that will pull up in Inkscape. Just give it a moment. There we go. Okay. So how can we see before we actually fold what will be included in these types of grid? One way to do that is to say, okay, I'm going to make a new layer for annotation, and I'm just going to call it Anno. And actually I want to drag that to above the, not a member of, above, okay. Maybe I'll drag the 58 down. This is not working as planned. Okay. Ah, well. We're going to hope it's transparent. So in this annotation layer, I'm going to grab my my Bezier curves tool, and I use the Shift F6 shortcut, which apparently is not the current shortcut. But what I can say is zooming in here, and here the bolded lines do show up a bit better. And I can count out by the bolded lines. It's every 8th one is bolded, so I can say, okay, this is 8 from the center. The next one is 16 from the center. And so if I have 16 from the center, I can click on that point and then go along grid lines until I reach the next grid line that also goes to the center. And I'm going to make that I think I usually do it in terms of point. And we're going to need to bring that to the front in order to see anything. Okay. We're just going to raise layer in the menu, and then we can see that. And I'm going to go ahead and make that more bold. And we have a couple options for where to go from there. One thing that I'm going to do is draw a line from the center to our 32 divisions. And that one I'm going to make even more bold. And I'm actually going to make it a different color. But let's make it blue. And so actually let's make it green. I know the red-green colorblind stuff is not ideal, but I needed to make it different from the mountain and valley lines. So we can take this and duplicate it and rotate halfway around, then stick that back so the green line is touching the center. What I'm going to do to get the full hexagon outline, I only need one green line. So I'm going to delete the one on top, select those two black lines, Control D to duplicate, and then go to my transform menu, rotate 60 degrees, and duplicate and rotate. So we can see from there that a 32-fold grid will have one ring of repeats around the center, but it will be chopping into the twists of the next repeat. Not ideal. And the alternative at 32 divisions, the next best alternative would be a diagonal grid where you have, I'm going to copy style on that and get a rough estimate of where those endpoints might be. Let's go for there and flat out to here. So if I have a diagonal grid, I actually get more grid divisions. And I'm going to duplicate that, send it up to the top, and then select, duplicate, rotate, duplicate, rotate. So you can see with a diagonal grid of the same number of divisions, and it went wrong somewhere. Okay. Because I did not put the top one exactly where it needed to be. That needs to be there. So we have the same position coming to the edge, but we actually get more of our pattern with a diagonal grid at 32 divisions than we did with our standard grid. So that's a trick to keep in mind. The other rotations of grid are going to be somewhere in the middle. And we can extend this information out to the next logical number, which is 48. And with 48, that's almost getting into the ring of repeats after, like it's after that next hexagon. So zooming in here, that next bolded division is after the hexagon after. And so if you want to really fine tune it, you're going to need to do a rotated grid. You're going to need to do odd divisions that are more than just a multiple of 3. So in this case, something like 40 divisions. So from 32, which is 16 from the center, we would do 2, 4 more. And that's going to get us 40 total divisions. So 16 plus 4 is 20, times 2 is 40. And that line, whether you do it on the diagonal grid, it wouldn't quite work on a aligned, like a edge parallel grid. But definitely the diagonal, definitely if you did the rotation, that is going to work out. And I have other videos on rotating grids. If you search rotated grid, I'm sure it'll come up. And so this is the process of seeing, okay, how much will fit on this grid? And seeing not just one grid parameter of like how many divisions, but also how is your grid rotated relative to the edge of the paper. I told you this is the part where the math comes in, but the rotation calculation is already done for you. So if you get any of my crease patterns, like I mentioned before, you will see that rotation calculation. You will see that 1/3 number. And I'll switch to top-down view to show like what that number means. So when I have some hexagon, that rotation A over L number means how far up the right-hand edge. So this is specifically if I have it oriented with an edge vertical on my right-hand side, how far up that edge do I need to mark so relative to the entire length of the edge. So this is completely agnostic to what grid you're using later, what, as in what number of divisions. It's agnostic even to whether you're using a square or a triangle grid. This rotation A over L is saying on my right-hand side, what fraction of the edge do I need to mark so that I can run my central axis of the grid through those points and through the center. So that's what's going on with that A over L. And when you have on a triangle grid on a hexagon specifically, the A over L is going to go from 0 to 1. 0 means it's an aligned grid. The grid lines are going to be parallel to the edge. So does 1. 1/2 means a diagonal grid. It means that the grid lines are going to be perpendicular to the edge of the paper. And so you're going to have a range from aligned to perpendicular back to aligned. And so looking at a number like 1/3, you can say, oh, 1/3 is closer to a half than to 0. Specifically twice as close in this particular case. And so you can say, if I don't want to do the full rotated grid, the best approximation out of the options of aligned and diagonal is diagonal. So you can moderate the math if you don't want to do something more precise. And as to how you get that fraction onto the edge, what I do is have a selection of scrap grids, so things I've taught on, just sitting on the side, and I'll use those as a ruler. So I'll say, okay, let's take this corner to a grid intersection down here, and I'm going to rotate so that the top corner is sitting 3 divisions above. And so for the case of 1/3, I would bring the bottom corner up to the 2/3 mark so that the fold is at 1/3. So bring that bottom corner up to the 2/3 mark. Hopefully that is contrasting enough with the grid lines. And then the fold is going to be at the 1/3 mark. So that's how you use the A over L. Again, I have much more detail on that in my rotated grids videos. And let's move on to a more complex example. So if we come back to the Advent of Tess ebook, I can scroll down, and one thing you'll also see in the ebook is the skeleton form. So you don't have to be paying as much attention to all of the little lines underneath. You can say, okay, where are my positions such that all of these lines connecting twists are lining up in the same direction, aka where are the places that would make a good break, a good border for the edge of the tessellation. And so I can run my mouse through here, and you can see that all of those lines that I'm crossing are pointing the same direction. Likewise, I can do that through here and through here. And there's all kinds of lines of that sort in these particular tessellations. So getting into something with a more extended symmetry pattern that has the same start, when we have this other style of repeats, you end up with some different calculations. And again, this is something that is easier to recognize once you have the background in the more abstract forms. So if we go back to that hexagons and triangles tiling diagram, and I bring up, so what we'd been looking at before was the full symmetry, where every hexagon is in a position of 6-fold rotational symmetry, and every triangle is in a position of 3-fold rotational symmetry, which just means that the hexagons have 6 of the same thing on each side, and the triangles have 3 of the same thing on each side. Then you can change that. Actually, let's do this one first. You can change that and say, okay, these hexagons have 6 of the same thing on each side, but those hexagons only have 3. And so that's what we're getting into with things like this star weave pattern, where we can see even in the photo, this hexagon has 6 of the same things on each side. This one only has 3. And it's like pairs of alternating open, closed, open, closed, open, closed. So that gives some different considerations for what is a pattern repeat. Now, it's not just every hexagon is a repeat. And so if I wanted to do pattern repeats of this, and I'm going to take that back to fitting the width, because we're going to need most of this grid to get those repeats, I'm looking at, okay, am I just counting the central hexagon as a repeat? Am I just going out past those repeating hexagons? Or am I also counting its surroundings? Am I going all the way out past these? And so we then have options. Do we, and here I give a shorthand, okay, the exact number is 13/14, but that's a really close to 1 number. So I say it's approximately aligned. And then coming down into the pattern, what we can look for is, okay, instead of counting out from the center, because we're going to go a long way from this center to get out past these hexagons, we can count in from the outside. And the last place that will have both of these still in place is about here. So this is with an aligned grid. We saw from the pattern, sorry, from the rotation A over L, we want something approximately aligned, so that's what we're looking for. And we're going up on this grid line that meets the corner, because that's the one coming from the center. and we can go 2, 4, 6, 8 spacings is really close, but it's also a really nice number. So 64 divisions total means 32 from the center to the corner. 32 minus 8 is 24. So 24 divisions from the center gives us 48 total divisions. So I could have also said that as 64 minus 8 times 2. 64 minus 16 is 48. I told you it was going to get a bit mathy. And so I would recommend 48 divisions for this because you're probably not going to want to do 56. 56 involves a division of 7. And I would be willing to bet, in fact, I am rather certain, that these photos here were folded on a 48-fold aligned grid. Just because you can see one of these closed hexagons is a little bit closer to the edge than the other. And what we saw in the crease pattern here, and I can count in from any corner I want, it's rotationally symmetric, is 2, 4, 6, 8. That's going to put me in line with the valley fold of one of the hexagons and one space out from the valley fold of the other, which is precisely what I see here. So there's some empty space. I'll zoom in on that. Some empty space sitting under this hexagon. There's not as thick of a layer right there, which tells me that that last grid spacing past the valley fold is not there. So a little bit of forensic work. This was done on a 48-fold aligned grid. And so you might be thinking, how does this apply to square grids? And it's exactly the same idea, except with a square grid, the diagonal grid goes from corner to corner. So for square grids, the rotation is like, do we have the grid lines centered in the middle of the paper? From the center of the edge to the center of the opposite edge versus corner to opposite corner. So that's our range of motion with the square grid. And of course we can have it from corner to corner to corner to opposite corner. And it just so happens that the terms diagonal and aligned apply oppositely to whether the lines are edge parallel versus edge perpendicular, because in the square case, the edge parallels are also edge perpendiculars to the other edges. Now that was a bunch of word soup, but the basic principles of we're counting out from the center and we're drawing a box if we need to, if we can't visualize it, to see what will fit in that. And maybe we're rotating the box a bit around that point that we counted from the center. But this is the same calculation on triangle grid, on square grid, on whatever grid we have. And there's a lot more complex that it can get. So if we go in here, and one other thing I will say is as those symmetries get spaced further and further apart, you actually get back to places that have good tiling breaks. So one way that you can tell that a pattern has good tiling breaks aligned with pattern repeats is if you see in the crease pattern, if you see in the cover page, the piece that I folded having these pleated borders, then that is an option for you. Now there's going to be other patterns where you don't see that photo. So something like Chiva Rumbera is in the same symmetry type as star weave, and you can tell because these triangles are 3 around that open hole, Whereas in convection, they are 2 on opposite sides. And that's the real distinction between these two patterns. Like literally, that is the only distinction. But one thing to notice about Chiva Rumbera is I don't actually get out to full repeats. And when you see that in a crease pattern cover page, that means I didn't fold a display piece. It means that whatever is there is what I could fit on a 32 fold aligned grid. Because the 32 fold aligned grid is really easy to fold, and I don't always fold display pieces of every pattern. So let's see if we can find another of those options further down. And I'm scrolling through. Sawtooth is an interesting example because it looks like, okay, so first off, we see this rotation over L, it's just aligned, so no need to worry about rotating the grid here. And then let's see if we can reverse engineer what division I used to get this very nice arrangement on this hex rom tri rom tiling. So one other thing that you'll see if you have taken courses with me is the tiling is super important. And let me take a moment to illustrate that by looking at 2 different arrangements of hexagons and triangles. So here we have hex tri rom tri, and when it resets in a moment, you'll see triangle rhombus triangle there. And here you see I'm adding a loop around the center every time. It's a nice smooth loop. There's no interruptions, there's no bumps. All of the lines in this tiling go straight through. That means I'm going to have excellent opportunities for borders here because I have all of these nice stopping places. So each of these drawings is a description of a possible stopping place while folding a tessellation. I call them tiling breaks. Whereas if we take the hexagon direct to rhombus, then triangle and rhombus to finish the loop of 4, that's very much not the case. We start seeing these grayed out shapes that are half complete until the next ring. And there's never another ring that has all of its twists completed. Now you could stop in the middle, but one thing you'll notice is the pattern repeats are not aligned with the edges of these rings. So how on earth did I get that nice pattern earlier? Well, we can take a look back at the crease pattern and say, okay, how far do I need to go to get outside that ring of rhombi around the next hexagons out? And so there we're saying, okay, starting in the center, and I'll zoom in, I'm going 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16. Okay, so 16 from the center is 32 total divisions. And that puts me in a very nice position where I'm 1 spacing out from the corner of my rhombus. As I follow those grid lines to either side, I'm going to hit the corners of the next triangles, but I'm going to pass through and also hit the corner of the next triangle in the next repeat, so the equivalent triangle in the next repeat, and get back out to my line that's going straight from the center through these rhombi. So this is a very convenient case where a 32 fold grid gets you exactly pattern alignment, exactly the pattern repeats that you want. And so the next number out on that, so we had 16 counting out from the center to get to here. And if I want to know how many divisions to get out in this area, I can count in from the center, or sorry, count in from the corner and say 2, 4, 6, 8. So 48 is going to be cutting it really close, but I think that's our best option here because 50 would require 2 divisions of 5, and I'm not here for that, frankly. It would make a nice border, but it's 50. So go with 48 on that one. So you could also do, let's see, what would be another good one? Yeah, so 56 would get you the next hexagons, but it's going to be a bit of a lumpy border because it's going to be waving in and out as you go, which frankly is going to be true for any border in this tiling. So yeah, the 32, the 48, those both work really well for this particular tessellation. And then if we go to some of those alternate options, like let's say spinning saws, then you're going to see, okay, these repeats are further apart. Here we have that A over L of 1/3 again. And actually, one thing to be really cautious of when you're using rotated grids is it matters which side you start folding from. So that fraction has to be on the front of the paper, has to be on the side that the crease pattern says is front. So if I have red for mountain fold, blue for valley fold, this hexagon is on the front, and that fraction has to be on the front. Because if you flip it over, you get the inverse, or not the inverse, but the complement of that fraction relative to the number 1. And you're going to run into errors. Now, why am I bringing this up? Because for this particular tessellation, I accidentally folded it on the wrong side of the paper once before I folded it right. So yeah, there's lots to get into there. And with this particular one, we're looking for these groups of hexagons surrounded by rhombus surrounded by triangles, but they're not as directly connected as we saw in the previous tessellation. So if we're going for the group, we need to get all the way out to 48, it looks like, before we get everything. If we're using an aligned grid, again, we can get away with fewer divisions if we're using a diagonal or a rotated grid. And in general, you can get away with using the fewest divisions for the rotated grid, specifically tailored to the tessellation. But that's usually going to come with more odd divisions. And so if I wanted to count and say, okay, for this particular one that I folded for the photo here, I have 2 sets of repeats outside of the center. What grid do I need? First, find the center, then find the next set of repeats after that, then find the next set of repeats after that, and that's going to turn out to be a 64 fold. So that's going all the way to the edge, 64 fold rotated grid. So I need it to be rotated because otherwise I'm going to be cutting off bits of a repeat, and I can't exactly see what I would be cutting off there, but I can say, okay, this rhombus is exactly the same as this rhombus. See, it has the open triangle at the same spacing on the other side. It has the open triangle above at the same spacing. They're the same rhombus for our purposes. And if I were to draw a line for our diagonal grid, actually we can get away with a diagonal grid here, but it's not going to have the repeats aligning with the edge. So there's trade-offs to be made. And as you go into the more and more complex patterns, so let's get into the 170s. Okay, yeah, that's the same tiling as this one, same tiling. This one's different. This one is using a tiling that I call rhombus ladder. And here we see I folded a demo piece. If you want to know what grid I used for that, the first clue always is zoom in on those photos and see if the grid is parallel to the edge, if it's perpendicular to the edge. Right here, it really looks like the grid is perpendicular to the edge. And yeah, looking around at all of the different places where I can see the grid meeting the edge, that really looks perpendicular. And so, okay, I'm looking for a perpendicular grid. And by the way, this is what I do when I'm trying to figure out what I folded before, if I don't want to go into my database. Like if someone asks me about a particular pattern on Instagram, what grid did you use on this? Well, there's a lot of variables, a lot of different options, and so I don't necessarily know. So I'm looking for, okay, where are these big hexagons around the center? And getting into the next rhombus after those big hexagons. So there's my center. There's my big hexagons. And as I count out from the center, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16. So 32-fold diagonal. That is what I used on that particular pattern. Now, if I wanted to fold this particular one so that I had repeats aligned with the edge, I'm actually going to use an aligned grid. Because if we look back at that A over L, 2 over 19 is really close to my threshold. Like usually I say anything less than a tenth or more than 9/10 is basically aligned. In this case, since I need to go all the way out to 64 divisions to reach, like to include all of the next pattern repeats, and even then, the aligned grid at 64 divisions is cutting into those next big hexagons around the repeat of the center. That, like, I might actually want to rotate that. But what I would do is, again, go to the next repeat up or next repeat over and say, okay, where is my analogous position to this closed triangle down here? And it looks like that analogous position is off the edge of the paper over here, which gives me some hope for the rotation, because I can see that if it's aligned, it clears the corner of this hexagon here. So if it's rotated and hitting that next triangle, if I don't have that under my face, if it's using a rotated grid on 64, it's going to be hitting around here and continuing on until it hits the other corner over here somewhere. So we have options. So if I want to fold just an expression of the pattern for this one, I'm going to use a 32 fold diagonal triangle grid. If I want to fold the next full repeats, I'm going to use a 64 fold grid and actually use the rotation, even though it's a teeny tiny rotation, but it's actually going to make a difference in this case. And this is another one where you're going to be folding all the way to the edge. You're not going to get a border. So you're just focusing on how do you get outside of those next repeats. And there's quite a few patterns that have these extended symmetries, but we also get back to some that are a little more tractable that have tiling breaks again. So this is knotted web. One of the convenient things about knotted web is it's aligned, so we don't need to worry about any rotation. And I can tell you right now that this demo piece here that you see is on a 64 fold grid. And you can see there's lots of repeats. There are 2 rings of repeats that are the same as the center, and we're getting into the next, even with a border around on a 64 fold grid. So we're able to kind of see that, especially, okay, when we're looking for these aligned patterns, we're looking for the exact same repeat on the same grid line. And one of the nice things about knotted web, and it's the next day's pattern of dancing triangles, is that we're going to have tiling breaks. So this pleat is going this way, this pleat's going this way, this pleat's going this way. Those 3 are all going the same direction along this line where I want to stop folding. And that's going to be true as I move further and further out as well. So there's lots of options for how to fold things. Lots and lots of tessellations to do it on in these Advent of Tess ebooks. And one other thing I'll mention, as you get into those later days for Advent of Tess 2023, where we're using the trapezoids, you're going to run into these tilings that might have one nice tiling break, and never another. So here, so the other thing I'll do, if it's a crazy fraction, you can simplify that. Like you can plug that into your calculator and say, what other fraction that I know is this really close to? And most of the time, if you're leaving a decent sized border, it's not going to make a difference. It's just going to make it easier to fold. So now you've seen, as I've shown you, how to figure out by looking at the crease pattern what grid I used for the result that I got. You have seen the difference between directly aligning repeats to the edge versus aligning tiling breaks to the edge, these places where we have nice borders. And then we have like more of a demo piece like this one, where it's not really doing more repeats, but it is showing all of the components of the pattern and how it would repeat. So I can see on here that these 2 trapezoids are the same as these 2 trapezoids. And that's how the pattern is going to repeat. On this one, I actually did get more repeats, and here I improvised a bit at the edge, if I remember correctly. Or maybe I just, yeah, maybe I didn't, because I have these little bits of open hexagon twist at these locations, and the rest of it is a nice pleated border. So you can get some intermediate states sometimes, especially with these trapezoids paired with other mixed depth twists. And let's see if I can find, so this one I folded all the way to the edge. This one I did not fold all the way to the edge, and I have some interesting pleat layering. So you can see it right there. That would be intersecting, would have other stuff going on with it, but I chose to leave it as a pleat overlap because it was so close to the edge and it was the only thing standing in the way of getting a pleated border. So that's what's going on. That's what's going through my head as I start folding more and more of these tessellations. So here on medallions, the final day of Advent of Tess for this last year, we have that rotational A over L of 1/2. That means it's a diagonal grid, very convenient. But it has high density everywhere, and you can see on this back photo that those mixed depth hexagon twists are overlapping each other. It's a bit of a pain to fold. What's actually easier to fold, that I didn't figure out until later, is trophy room. So this is an alternative ending for medallions. The repeats are closer together. It's easier to fold. There's less overlapping twists. Now everything is all still close together because we had that flagstone start, but these mixed depth rhombi on the back are not overlapping each other like the mixed depth hexagons were. So that's what I mean by easier. And also the process of folding it felt easier. So there's lots of ways to enjoy these patterns. I do have some additional resources here at the end of the ebook talking about where you can get crease pattern template files. So if you want to explore your own variations on these tessellations, you can do that. You can have the crease pattern files, the background grid, the twists, all of those things that you need to go and make your own variations. Those are freely available. And then the project planning masterclass really talks about what I went over today, but in more detail, covering more situations. And that is paired with tessellation garden. So if, and actually I'm gonna scroll up there, if you want not just the 56 patterns in this year's Advent of Tess book or the 50 in last year's, but all of my patterns, and you want to get them as soon as possible, then tessellation garden is the way to go. And I have a coupon code in the ebook that I probably flashed for a few seconds there. So if you want to use that, feel free. But there's so much more to explore. And for example, there's 100 or so square grid patterns that are probably not going to end up in Advent of Tess anytime soon. So that's another way to learn even more and fold even more origami tessellations. So happy folding, everyone. Thanks for joining me in this discussion about what grid to use for your origami tessellation projects. And I will see you next week.